authority. So welcome to our 9th session on Jewish literacy. We are working our way through the subject of Jewish Jewish sacred literature. And just to refresh, we spent a session on Torah, first 5 books of the Bible. We spent a session on the Hebrew Bible, the kind of an overall view of Bible. Last week, we talked about Talmud, Mishnah, and Talmud. This week, we are moving on to Midrash, Halacha, and Jewish legal codes. So let's just jump right into it. As I always mention, our work is sponsored by the Federation and the Affordable Living Choices Trust. And you can find materials, including videos, on my website. But I think by now you all know that at the end of every session, I send out at least a link to the videos of these sessions. Okay, so let's talk about Midrash. The word Midrash actually comes from the Hebrew verb lirdrosh, which means to seek out. So Midrash really originally were sermons. If you go back to original sources of Midrash, they read like sermons. It'll say Rabbi so-and-so opened by saying. So it's structured like a sermon, which seeks greater understanding of a text by a searching examination of the language used. And this is actually, it's sort of a technical issue, but for Midrash to be authentically Midrash, it's got to be text-based. The connection to the text can be very tenuous, as we'll see in a couple of the Midrashim we'll read. But if you're just making up a story sort of out of whole cloth, then some people call things like this modern Midrash, but there's people that argue that it isn't really Midrash. There's a wonderful book with which you may be familiar called The Red Tent, which is a deep dive into the story of Dinah. And sometimes it's called The Rape of Dinah, very interesting chapter in Genesis. And the author, Anita Diamant, really develops a lot of wonderful, narrative and novel stories about this, but some of it has no basis in the text. So we can argue about whether that's Midrash. Typically, Midrash is what Paul Harvey, some of us with some gray hair will remember Paul Harvey used to call the rest of the story. So there's a story in the Bible and there's lots of gaps, and we're wondering, what's going on in the gaps. When Abraham is told to take his son and sacrifice him, what was Abraham's reaction? The text doesn't really tell us. So Midrash is going to fill in. Midrash can be either legal, which the Hebrew term for Jewish law, we'll get into this a little more in a moment, is halacha, or sermonic, which is just stories. A halachic Midrash would be taking what's in the Bible, in the Torah, where we're forbidden to cook a baby goat in its own mother's milk. The rabbis are going to take this and expand it to forbid any eating of milk with meat. So, at a very simple level, forbidding cheeseburgers. And then they're going to take it even further. They're going to say we should have a separate set of dishes for milk and meat to avoid contamination. So that's an example of halachic Midrash. A Gadic Midrash is more stories, but don't result in specific issues of Jewish law. And we're actually going to read one about Abraham breaking idols in his father's shop, which is a pretty well-known Midrash in the Jewish world. And it seeks to explain, what was it about Abraham that caught God's attention? How is it that God recognized that Abraham would be a good candidate to be the first Jew? There are many collections of Midrash. If you hear, now I'm just going to have show and tell with my books. If you hear just people saying in the Midrash, quite often they're talking about Midrash Rabbah, which Rabbah means great or large. So here, this is a volume. Actually, this is not even all of Midrash on Genesis. And just for fun, here's a collection, that same collection, Midrash Rabbah. In the original, And, it's a lot of fine print in Hebrew. And up here are the Midrashes. And down here is the commentary by classic commentators on these Midrashim. Another wonderful, well, there's lots of great collections of Midrash. So, for example, the term Midrash is in 10 different sections, one on each of the book, Midrash Rabbah, 5 books of the Torah, and the 5 scrolls, which I've mentioned there. And it spans a period of, 500-700 years when these stories are written. So this is after the Talmud. There are many collections of Midrash. However, many have disappeared. So, and I mentioned this idea of modern Midrash and the red tent, and that actually started, I would guess there must be a half a dozen books like the red tent. So there's one about Queen Esther, kind of a deep dive into the Esther story. There's a deep dive into the Sarah story. And I'm sure there are others. The success of the book, The Red Tent, resulted in some imitation. There are also some good, interesting collections. So there's one by Louis Ginsburg, which is actually originally is a 5-volume work published in 1909. And then the Jewish Publication Society came out with kind of a 1-volume version, which focuses on midrashim that are about the Bible. There are also midrashes that go beyond the Bible. So this is actually very nice and readable. And the one thing it does is it tries to just go with the narrative of the Bible and just add every story that it can think of. There's another one which I really love if you're really into this stuff. This one is called the Book of Legends, Sefer Haggadah, in English translation. Also, the original Hebrew was in the early 1900s. This one I love, and a lot of the Midrash, and I'm going to show you, are from this book. It's pretty fine print, as you can see, and it's pretty thick. So some of it is biblical, but it will get into the stories of the rabbis and heaven and hell and the angel of death, and it's exhaustive. One of the things I particularly love about that collection, which I'll point out as I show you some examples, is it gives the source. Ginsburg's book just tells the story, and there's actually a separate volume with it, which is an index, but it's tedious to use. As you'll see in a moment, the Book of Legends actually has very good sourcing. So if you find a Midrash you're really interested in and you have access to it, and of course, I need to update all of this with Sefaria, because there's Sefaria, SCFARIA.com or org, I don't remember. But all of these materials are in there, and most of them in English translation. Another book which some of us really love, and it's worth my just highlighting, is called The Tree of Souls by Howard Schwartz, and it's about the mythology of Judaism. And I taught a class of 5 different sessions, and I probably will teach another 5 on this. Just a wide range of mystical and far-flung Jewish mythology. You wouldn't believe that this is Jewish sacred literature, and you'll find lots of other collections of Midrash. So I want to read a little Midrash. This actually is from the Talmud, is the source, and I'm just going to read it without dwelling too much on the structure here. This is a Steinsaltz English translation of the Talmud. It was related on the day that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi died. Yehuda HaNasi is the guy who compiled the Mishnah. So very important rabbi. The rabbis decreed to be observed as a fast. Everybody prayed for God's mercy so that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi would recover from his illness. They went so far as to say, anyone who proclaims that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi has died will be pierced with a sword. Talk about blaming the messenger. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's maidservant went up on the roof of the house and said, the heavenly creatures desire Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi up in heaven, and the earthly creatures desire him on earth. So she's now praying along with his students that are surrounding him. So she prays, may it be your will that the earthly creatures overcome the heavenly creatures, and that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi remain among the living. But when she saw how many times he went to the outhouse and first took off his tefillin and then put him back on, and how he suffered from the intestinal illness that plagued him, she altered her prayers and said, may it be your will that the heavenly creatures overcome the earthly creatures, and that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi be relieved of his misery and laid to his final rest. So she sees his horrible pain and presumably gastrointestinal. And if you go to an outhouse, you can't wear your tefillin, which are wrapped around your arms. So he was suffering. But the rabbis did not silence themselves and stop praying for God's mercy, so Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would not be taken from them. So the image is Yehuda Hanasi's students are around him praying that he recover or not die, and he can't die while they're praying. So the maidservant took a pitcher and cast it down from the roof to the ground, and it smashed to pieces. Alarmed by the sudden noise, the rabbis silenced themselves and momentarily stopped praying for God's mercy. And in that interim, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died. And then the story will go on and discuss who's going to break the news, which is an interesting story. But that's not what I really want to focus on. I often think of this story and always tell this story when families are facing the very difficult decision to stop treatment on someone, and specifically to pull the proverbial plug on a respirator to disconnect someone who is dying and suffering from a respirator, which is sustaining them. In a sense, the rabbi's prayers were sustaining them. And another important point of this Midrash is she is never criticized for doing what she did. I don't know if there's a question there with the bushes, Rachel.
Rabbi, yes, there is a question.
Yes.
One of the, I guess, core tenets of being Jewish and living a Jewish life is holding life sacred.
Yes.
How, in this context here that you're kind of describing, and also in this midrash, here, how I guess you reconciled that issue of continuing preserving life and.
Right. It's a great question, and it gets raised as technology develops into responsa. We're going to see responsa literature, which is Jewish legal questions. The bottom line answer to your question is you're not allowed to practice euthanasia. Euthanasia means intervening to hasten someone's death. But on the other hand, you are not allowed to interfere with the dying process. And as you can imagine, with technology, this can become a difficult issue. So if someone is naturally dying, and the only result of your intervening with a respirator, with, all kinds of other interventions, is to prolong the dying process, you're actually going against Jewish law by doing that. Of course, if the goal is to bring someone back to health, you're obligated to do that, and you're not permitted, even if someone wants to terminate their life. California has an assisted suicide law that is definitely inconsistent with Jewish law. Marlene.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. So Jewish ethics, then that assisted dying thing in California and other places would be against Jewish religion then, correct?
Yes, it would be against Jewish law. Yes. And, I often talk about this as one area where I had a sort of an ethical conundrum, because I am personally in favor of allowing assisted suicide and was supportive of the law. And I was asked to be on a panel about that, and I couldn't be on the panel because no matter how I would couch my caveats, there is no question in my mind that people would hear that the rabbi and therefore Judaism is supportive of it. So yes, go ahead.
Would then, if a person does that that would be considered suicide. Would that
Mhm.
mean they couldn't be buried at a Jewish cemetery?
Yeah, so there are restrictions against suicides and their funerals. And then what the rabbis do, and this is a classic rabbinic trick, is they say everyone who commits suicide was operating under an irresistible compulsion and therefore not responsible for the sin of suicide. Therefore, in theory, you shouldn't bury them with other Jews in a Jewish synagogue, but in practice, you're allowed to, since they were responding to an irresistible compulsion.
So did you say the Jewish religion thinks when you do that assisted suicide, when you do what you have to do when you want to decide you want to end your life because of health reasons, do they consider it suicide?
Yes, they would consider it suicide.
Suicide.
And then the
Okay.
question is, does suicide bar you from some of these elements? And the rabbis would say, technically, yes, practically, no.
But Orthodoxy for sure would not allow them to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, right?
Wrong. So
Really?
Orthodoxy would say the person was operating under an irresistible
They would also
compulsion.
say that. Okay.
Yes, yes. My very first day as a rabbi, probably the morning, I had a couple come in and tell me that they had talked with my predecessor there, although I think I was still a student at the time, and they had arranged that they were going to commit suicide, the two of them. They were elderly, they were in poor health, and they didn't want to spend the last years in a nursing home. They wanted to commit suicide, and they were making arrangements to have their funeral service in the synagogue, and they wanted to be sure that I was okay with that. Welcome to your new job, Rabbi. And and I started calling my professors and wondering whether I was a mandated reporter and all kinds of issues. And about 2 years later, they did. Okay, this is from that book, Sefer HaAgadah. These are just wonderful little parables that I love. So, so here you can see at the bottom, it says, this is Genesis Rabbah, actually the volume that I mentioned, and it gives you the reference. And this would be then a description in another text as well. The Lord God made heaven and earth. What's going on here? Why is this Midrash? Because in the story in Genesis, in the opening chapter of Genesis, God is always referred to as Elohim. In the middle of chapter 2, verse 4, when we go to the Garden of Eden, the reference to God shifts simply from Elohim to Yud-He Vav-He Elohim, or I would say Adonai Elohim. So what the rabbi is saying is commenting on here is why the change in the way we describe God in this text. Okay, a parable of a king who had cups made of delicate glass. The king said, if I pour hot water into them, they will expand and burst. If cold water, they will contract and break. What did he do? He mixed hot and cold water and poured it into them, and so they remained unbroken. Likewise, the Holy One said, if I create the world with the attribute of mercy alone, its sins will be too many. If with justice alone, how could the world be expected to endure? So I will create it with both justice and mercy, and it may endure. That's the Midrash. You might miss the whole point of what connects it. So there's a helpful footnote. In rabbinic conception, Adonai, Lord, represents the attribute of mercy, while Elohim, God, represents the attribute of justice. Both, according to Genesis 2:4, were brought together at the making of heaven and earth. That's kind of classic, nice, agadic midrash, the fact that God, quite often you will hear in Christian circles referencing the God of the Old Testament as only being a God of justice and not mercy and not love. That's absolutely misrepresenting Jewish scripture. This is pretty long. I'm not going to read it. This is about Abraham's family, that they used to make images and sell them in the market. Where are they getting this from? Well, Abraham is the first monotheist. Therefore, presumably his parents were not monotheists. So the rabbis are now going to speculate on that. And they say, well, Abraham's father was in the business of making idols. And one day, his father goes on some kind of business trip, leaves Abraham in charge. Then it would be Avram in charge, and and Abraham smashes all the idols. The story is much more detailed. You can read about it, in the PDF. Abraham smashes all the idols. His father comes home and said, "What happened?" And Abraham says, "Well, I went to give an offering of food to the idols, and they all started arguing with each other." And so what happened? The biggest idol took this stick in his hand and smashed all the other idols so he could have all the food. And his father says to Abraham, "Do you think I'm an idiot? I made these idols yesterday. They can't do anything." And so let's see. Abraham answered, "You say they cannot. Let your ears hear what your mouth is saying." And this God notices. In the Bible, there is no explanation for why God chooses Abraham. So the Midrash fills in that gap. This is the one I talk about. For 2.5 years. The school of Shammai and Hillel argued about whether it would have been better for man not to have been created than been created. And they voted and decided it would have been better for man not to have been created than created. But now that he has been created, let him search his past deeds. Some say let him examine what he is about to do. Talking about past deeds not being possible to change. I just like the idea that the rabbis, they had plenty of time, and for 2.5 years they discussed this question. This is a very famous one. I'm not going to read all of them. It happened, a certain heathen, namely a non-Jew, came before Shammai and said to him, "Take me as a proselyte, namely I will convert, but on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah, all of it while I stand on one foot." Shammai instantly drove him away with a builder's measuring rod he happened to have in his hand. Namely, he whacked him with a ruler. When the heathen came before Hillel, Hillel agreed to make him a proselyte, saying, "What you don't like, don't do to your neighbor. This is the entire substance of Torah. All the rest is commentary. Go and study it." So this is the Jewish statement of the Golden Rule. There are lots of other statements of the Golden Rule. A key issue is go and study it. But what he's doing is boiling down Torah into the Golden Rule. There's a very common rabbinic expression, I would say Jewish Israeli expression, which in Hebrew is beregel echad, which means on one foot. And usually it refers to kind of what we call now as an elevator discussion. Explain this to me, but Rabbi, don't teach me Midrash in an 1.5-hour session. Teach me beregel echad. Namely, I want about a 2 or 3 minute version of it. So that's Midrash. Any questions specifically on Midrash before I jump into Jewish law? I know we're going quickly. I mean, you'd think in 18 weeks you wouldn't have to go quickly, but welcome to my world. Halacha and legal codes. The word halacha means a path or walking. It's the term applied to Jewish law and emphasizes that a Jewish law is a path for one's life. So halacha is a path, and presumably you're walking on that path. A number of the terms for sin, like aveira, means to cross over the path. So you're on the path, but you strayed from the path. Interestingly, in Arabic, the word for Muslim law is Sharia, and it also refers to this idea of the path of walking life. As we discussed last week in the Talmud, or 2 weeks ago, I guess last week we were off for Thanksgiving, the Talmud is not well organized or accessible to the average Jew or even the average rabbi. This is further complicated by the fact that before Gutenberg, and we're talking 1500 or so, if you owned a book, it was handwritten. And so all these materials would be on scrolls or codexes. Sometimes these books were bound in, or the scrolls were bound into books. Talmud is not small, it's a bookshelf. And someone comes and asks a question of the rabbi, what time in the morning do I say the Shema? Shema is a morning prayer. I'm supposed to say it every morning. At what time is it too early to say the Shema? Or at what time is it too late to say the Shema? It would be nice if the Talmud was well organized, but the rabbi would just have to be very familiar with all this material and know, oh, I know that. That's in the beginning of the tractate called Berachot. So what happens over time is certain scholars start organizing Jewish law. So these are people who are very well familiar with all the Jewish law contained in the Talmud, and probably even some rulings post-Talmudic, and they are going to collect it and organize it by subject matter. And there are lots of, I would say there are 5 or 6 very well-known collections of Jewish law. I'll just mention 2 here. One is called the Mishnah Torah, which is sometimes called the repetition of the Torah. And so it's organized by subject matter. There's laws relating to kings, there's laws relating to keeping kosher, there's laws relating to each of the holidays. And so even though this is still a handwritten text, at least every town could have one of those texts. And if you came to the rabbi in your own town, that rabbi would have a much better chance of being able to give you a straightforward answer. And the next major code, which is still considered authoritative, is called the Shulchan Aruch, which literally means the prepared table, about 1500. And I always think the reason for the significance and popularity is this is the first code of law that was prepared after the printing press. So literally every rabbi could have a copy of the Shulchan Aruch. And because it's printed, all the copies are going to be identical. And so it becomes a very key text of Jewish law. It's written by Joseph Cairo, who is Sephardic. And so again, Shulchan Aruch means prepared table. Moses Asirles writes what he calls the mappa, the tablecloth, which is basically a commentary on this text for Ashkenazim. And people will still call themselves, if you meet your Chabad rabbi, he might refer to himself as a Shulchan Aruch Jew. Beyond this, there's a whole collection of literature which I personally find fascinating, called responsa literature. Responsa, probably a Latin term, meaning response. In Hebrew, they are called tshuvot, which means answers or responses. And questions arise constantly after the completion of the Talmud, and also after these books of Jewish law are put together, and they are sent to traditionally to acknowledge scholars whose decisions are authoritative, not because they're the chairman of a Jewish law committee. We have those committees today, but in ancient times they were very well respected. So their decisions would be considered binding, certainly on their communities. And they are called responsa or responsum individually. And they're case law, and they're fascinating to read. We're going to take a look at some of them. And they address issues, the one I always think about is electricity is invented. So electricity is not going to be referenced anywhere in the Talmud or in the Shulchan Aruch or any of these codes of laws. So the rabbis are going to have to come up with and address the issue of how do we deal with electricity. And ultimately, they're going to decide electricity is fire. So all the existing laws we've made about fire, we're going to apply to electricity. And, the issue of when can you discontinue treatment? And, you go from traditionally a definition of death of someone is cessation of breathing. That goes back to the Garden of Eden, where it says God breathed the breath of life into Adam, and he became a living nefesh, a living soul, or a living person. So therefore, if the first breath makes the person a living soul, the last breath means the person is dead. Now we have, respirators, and we have, we can look at brain activity. So even in the Orthodox world, they're going to accept other definitions, and these will be responsa. Many responsa, for example, all of Rashi's have been lost. We have none of Rashi's responsa. How do we know we wrote them? I think there's literature which talks about Rashi's responsa. Ryan.
So I have a question. I get when sort of new technology arises or new things, did the response ever change? If someone were able to like prove scientifically, like actually like electricity is not fire at all, like would that debate get reevaluated, or are some things kind of just set in stone and that it doesn't get discussed again, despite maybe science catching up with understanding?
Yeah, so one way, and I would characterize it, as I would say in the Orthodox world, Jewish law, once it's made, never gets retracted. It can get refined to the point of retraction, but technically they're not retracting. I would say the big innovation in conservative Judaism is to unabashedly just retract law without pretending that you're not retracting it. So as an example, this is kind of a, on Passover, you're not allowed to own chametz. So the rabbis come up with a legal fiction that you sell all your chametz to a non-Jew. So for the 8 days of Passover, you don't own it. It's still sitting in your closet. Presumably you created a certain little area and taped it closed and so on. But the legal fiction is you no longer own it. So they haven't retracted that law, and they haven't even modified the law. What they've come up with is an innovation for getting around the law. But it's a very good question. Larry, if you're saying something, I don't know if you're talking to your cat or want to say something to us, but unmute yourself if you're.
Well, I was talking to myself and the cat, but
yeah, the
what I was
cat's
saying,
behind you and very interested. I'm impressed.
yeah, is the word loophole,
Mm.
like today's law. You know,
Yes.
they have. So the rabbis, like you said, have created what we would call loopholes today.
Yes, yes. There's a classic phrase where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. And another example is suicide. I mean, the rules are
Yeah.
you don't bury a suicide with other Jews. The answer is you're going to exempt all suicides based on this irresistible compulsion. I have a guy who's actually brother of a congregant of mine who was an Orthodox gay rabbi who for quite a while was anonymous, but actually came out. And he made the point, if the rabbis wanted to just say that being gay is an irresistible compulsion, that would solve that problem, but they didn't want to do it. As I said, that where there's a rabbinic will, there is a halachic way of getting around the laws. So just some other, this is from Mishnah Torah, so now we're in Jewish law. So one thing which is also pretty well known in the Jewish world is Rambam, which is Maimonides, describes 8 degrees of charity. So from the highest concept of charity to the lowest concept of charity. The highest is to give a neighbor who's fallen on hard times assistance through a gift alone, or making him a partner, or finding him a job. You know, teach a man to fish rather than just giving a fish. Next is the giver doesn't know who received the charity, and the recipient doesn't know who the giver is. So when I was a congregational rabbi, there was a rabbi's discretionary fund, and people would donate to the discretionary fund, and I could help congregants. The congregant didn't know the individual who was giving. The individual who was giving did not know the congregant. You can argue things like United Way are very similar to that. The third is when the giver knows who receives the charity, but the receiver doesn't know where the aid came from. There's some little commentary here. Next is where the recipient of the charity knows the giver, but the giver doesn't know who to whom he gave. Next is when a man puts alms into the hands of the poor before he is asked, so the giver and the receiver know who it is. The next one is he gives, but only after he's asked. And the next one is when a man gives less than he should, but cheerfully. And the lowest is when a man gives grudgingly. So that's Maimonides' hierarchy of charity. This is another important one, also from Rambam. and I talk about it a lot. Every Jew is required to offer up his life for the sanctification of the name of God, but this applies only to the capital crimes of idolatry, unchastity, adultery and incest, or murder. One must choose death rather than commit these crimes. Anyone who does so has sanctified the name of God. But if a Jew has a choice of breaking some other commandment and losing his life, he should yield to the sin rather than give up his life. For the Torah says a man is to live by God's commandments, not to die by them. A Jew who sacrifices his life by refusing to violate a divine commandment other than those three is guilty of suicide. So this, I talk about this when I talk about fasting on Yom Kippur. If you're starving and you're going to hear some response from the Holocaust, you are required to eat whatever is available, including non-kosher food. This is another interesting one with which most people are not familiar. A synagogue may be turned into a house of study, but a house of study may not be turned into a synagogue, because the holiness of a house of study is greater than that of a synagogue. Objects may be raised to holier use, but not lowered to less holy use. All the educators should like that one. This one I find fun. This is Moses Asirles, who wrote the Ashkenazi commentary on Shulchan Aruch about wearing a yarmulke. I love this. I do not know, he writes, of any prohibition against pronouncing blessings with the head uncovered. To some scholars, it is evident that one is forbidden to even mention God without covering the head. I do not know the source of this prescription. I even find disagreement on this question in the Talmud, and he cites the passages. It's clear from this that there is no real prohibition against reciting the Shema with the head uncovered, and God did not burden the Jews with such a requirement. But what can I do, he says, since other rabbis have said that the head must be covered when reciting a blessing? I'm surprised to learn that they even prohibit an uncovered head when not in prayer. I do not know where this prohibition came from, but I cannot be lenient in this matter. Even without a prohibition, even if piety were not involved, a scholar ought to follow the custom, since people consider an uncovered head a violation of Jewish law. This, I love this, because basically what it's saying is the custom ultimately takes on the character of Jewish law. And most synagogues will have their own individual customs about the way things are said, or, in Temple Adat Elohim, where I'm the scholar in residence, the custom is at the end of the service, everybody joins arms and sways back and forth singing Oseh Shalom. And Cheryl, I'm saying this in particular for you. I once asked the rabbi at a discussion session whether that was an example of our minhag. The Hebrew word is minchag, but this is a minchag. But minchag, the custom of the place, takes on characteristics of Jewish law, and nobody really knows why we keep our heads covered. There are lots of ideas, and some of them might be true, but if Moses Asirles, who basically wrote the Ashkenazi version of the Shulchan Aruch, if he didn't know in 1500, pretty much it devolves to minchag. There is an amazing, off-filled book called Responsa of the Holocaust. It's actually, this is a 1-volume English version, and it's very simplified, written by a rabbi who survived the Holocaust, and people would come to him for legal decisions, and he wrote them out and put them in little cans and bottles and buried them, and after the war was able to recover his materials. It's really hard even to find this book in English. I'm very glad that I have it. So I'll give you some examples of responsa from the Holocaust. Every day, the Nazis forced 1,000 Jewish slave laborers to work at building an airport. The only food given these laborers is a bowl of soup. Many of the workers would not eat the soup because it's not kosher, thus endangering their lives. Is it permitted to eat the soup? Yes, the principle of lifting a ban on non-kosher food in order to save an endangered life may be applied in this case, which is what we were reading. Here's one that may surprise you. Is it permissible for a man to save his life so that he may join the Partisans by purchasing a certificate of baptism? Response: such an act is forbidden, although the purchaser of the certificate does so with definite mental reservations, believing still in the God of the Jews. In any event, it is our duty and privilege to suffer martyrdom, our duty and privilege to invite death, rather than deceive the Gentiles into thinking that we have denied the God of Israel. So,
Unless you're Angelo Roncalli, and he did that during
well,
the
lots
war.
of Jews, yeah, lots of Jews did it, and you can argue all of the conversos basically did this. Those during the Spanish Inquisition times who pretended to be Catholic while secretly practicing Judaism. I'm just saying, and here is a rabbi in the Holocaust who would say, no, you suffer death, even if you can buy a baptismal certificate.
Except Angelo Roncalli became the Pope.
Oh, okay, that's probably not bolstering his rabbinic credentials. And
But
here's
to
a
save
case.
Jewish children, he faked baptismal certificates.
Yeah, and that actually might be permitted. I mean, the responsa in here make a distinction about whether things are public or private, whether it appears that people are consciously rejecting God. So it's this public blasphemy, which is the issue, and it does get more nuanced there. There's issues about, you know, redeeming Jewish children from Christian homes after the Holocaust. I mean, it's some pretty powerful reading. Here is a question that someone wants to die circumcised, but they can't find a mohel, a ritual circumciser. Can they be circumcised by non-Jewish doctor? And the answer is yes. This is actually from the Shulchan Aruch. Actually, there is a book called the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And if you look at it, this is what it looks like. It says Code of Jewish Law, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Kitzur means small. And actually, I have a 100-year-old Jewish version of this. Basically, it's the elements of Jewish law that most people are going to have questions about. Because in the Shulchan Aruch, there are going to be all kinds of pretty far-fetched issues. I don't know if it actually deals with temple worship and so on. But so I just want to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that are in the Shulchan Aruch. So, and these come up all the time and actually come up very interestingly in responsive literature. What does it actually mean that you're commanded to honor your father and your mother specifically? So, and actually in one place it says honor your father and your mother. Another place it says every man shall fear Yirah, his mother and his father. And Yirah, I always think of 2/3 as awe and 1/3 as fear. This is kind of an interesting phrase that it says 3 parties have a share in man's creation. The Holy One, blessed be he, the father and mother. The man provides the white substance, the woman the red substance, and God blows in the breath of life. What is the fear, Yirah, due to parents? One must not stand in the place appointed for one's father according to his rank, and in the place where he prays. One should not sit in such a place. You can't contradict one's father, nor corroborate his words in his presence, even by saying, it's obvious that father is right. To what degree shall he be feared? If a son were attired in costly dress and presiding over a meeting, when his father and mother came in and tore his garments, struck his head, and spat in his face, he should neither insult them nor feel aggrieved in their presence, nor display anger toward them, but should remain silent and fear the King, who is the King of kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, who has thus decreed. He may, however, seek legal redress for damages. I think that's, there are Jewish lawyers. I don't know if you're aware of this. What's the honor due to parents? To provide them with food and drink, garments and clothing. He should bring them home and take them out with cheerful countenance, and even give them the greatest delicacy. but not show them an angry face. If his father and mother should be asleep, he shouldn't wake them up, even though their sleep will lose much profit. But if the father would much profit. But if the father would profit by being awoke, he should be awakened because he would be grieved. If his mother told him to do a certain thing which he did, and his father subsequently asked him, "Who told you to do this?" If he perceives that by telling him his mother asked him to do it, his father's anger would be kindled against his mother, he should not tell it to him, even if he himself would incur his father's wrath. So there's pretty great detail in the Shulchan Aruch itself, and even more interesting material in responsa literature. I'll just read this last one. If he saw his father transgressing any of the commandments of the Torah, he should not say to him, "Thou hast transgressed the commandment of the Torah," but rather he should say, "Father, is it not written thus and thus in the Torah?" As though asking for information and not as though he admonished him. The father will thus take the hint without being put to shame. This actually once happened to me, not by my son, but very early in my rabbinic career. I was officiating at a funeral, and it was a soldier who died, a veteran, I should say, and there was a flag ceremony. It's the first time I'd ever seen a flag ceremony, and I was so impressed by it, I forgot to say the Kaddish at the end of the funeral. And one of the elders of our community, who was far more knowledgeable about Judaism than I was at that point, came up to me and asked me, as though it were a serious question, "Rabbi, are we supposed to say the Kaddish now?" But he did it in a way that, he was appealing to my great wisdom rather than my idiotic, just failure to remember to do so. So here's an example of modern responsa. And I would say about half of one of those shelves are all responsa literature because I'm fascinated by it. It's ccarnet.org or something, Central Conference of American Rabbis, has online a lot, not all responsa, but has online a lot of responsa. So this will give you a flavor, and a lot of them are quite lengthy. This is a pretty simple one. The children have been informed that their mother is dying, and the physician believes that it is his responsibility to inform their mother of the hopelessness of her condition. The children have insisted that this news be kept from her, as they feel it will hasten her death and make the last period of her life miserable. What path should they follow? The main thing about responsa is it's case law. It's real issues. It's typically not, a responsum is not typically a theoretical legal discussion, although we do have some of those, but an actual case and answer. It is our principal task during illness, including the final illness, to maintain an attitude of hope in the patient. Therefore, the rabbinic tradition rejected the approach of the prophet Isaiah to King Hezekiah, in which he demanded that the king set his house in order, for you will die and not live. And actually, the king was healed and survived. In the Talmudic discussion of such situations, felt that prayer and hope should not cease even when the outlook is bleak. So here's a reference to, this would always be Babylonian Talmud, Berachot, page 10a. In another biblical story, the rabbis quoted the prophet Elijah was asked whether Ben-Hadad, the Aramean king, would recover, and he lied to encourage him. We may therefore stretch the truth to engender hope. This mood of hopefulness was carried even further by the injunction not to inform a seriously ill patient of the death of a relative that might change her mood. And that's a reference to the Shulchan Aruch. We must, of course, weigh this attitude against giving the patient sufficient time to prepare her affairs before death and the opportunity to make confession. And so this would be Mishnah. In this instance, there are no pressing business affairs which need to be settled. Personal confession can occur at any time. It need not be formalized into an occasion which will frighten the mother. The physician has done his duty by speaking of the condition to the children. If the mother inquires repeatedly from the physician and indicates that she wishes to know the truth, then it should be told to her. If that does not occur, we should follow the path of tradition and the inclination of the children and allow the mother to retain her currently hopeful attitude. This is an issue that occurs, not infrequently to rabbis. where I will be asked to visit someone who is dying, and I will be told, don't tell the person that they're dying. In some cases, I've even been told, don't tell the person that you're a rabbi, because in our culture, when clergy visits you in a hospital, it's not a good sign. And, I try and respect that, but I've also had, people I'm visiting saying, you can tell me, I know I'm dying, and, and I want to talk about it. So sometimes my role is actually to open that window so people can say their goodbyes. Marlene.
Two things. One, there are Jewish chaplains that specifically go to visit people who are in end stage life. They
Yes.
do go and have discussions with the people. Plus, in non-Jews, in Christians and stuff like that, they have their I'm not
Last rites.
they do the last rites,
Mhm.
at the hospital or whatever with the sprinkling of the water. So it's interesting that they say that, you shouldn't, you should give them hope. You shouldn't say anything because it would take their hope away that they're going to live.
So,
But-
so what I think is they're saying here really is you're not obligated to tell them the truth. You should use your judgment. Quite often, everybody knows what's going on. I mean, I have actually worked as a chaplain for hospice firms, and I volunteer for hospice firms as a chaplain. And in some cases, I would say more often than not, the person knows they're dying. I would say in many of the cases, I wind up going there and the person's unconscious. And, although I'll lead them through a final confession, it's highly likely that they're not aware of it. And there is a final confession in Judaism. This surprised me when I got
I was just going to ask you that.
Yep.
What do you mean there's a final confession? I never heard of that in the Judaism at all.
Well, now you know why you're taking this class. It's called
That's right.
it's called a vidui, which means confession. It's a term we use on Yom Kippur. I used to think that, and the way I explained it to people so as not to upset them unduly, I would say, it may well be that you're not going to survive to the next Yom Kippur, so you get to say your confession now.
What is it called again?
Vidui, V-I-D-U-I. But in fact, the confession on Yom Kippur comes from the tradition of deathbed confession. And, there's a formula for a standard deathbed confession. And I of course, in my Reform Rabbi's Manual, there's a less literal version of that, but it's absolutely part of Jewish tradition. When someone is dying, to lead them in a confession. And we, also reassure them that many people recover and there's no problem. It's not like you're giving up. But yeah, this same guy that asked me, should we say Kaddish at the funeral? When he was not doing well, and I would visit him regularly, and I would always ask him to remind me what his Hebrew name is. And he always said, just as long as you're asking me for the Misha Berach, a prayer for healing, and not for a vidui. But it's absolutely part of Jewish tradition. And Marlene, I, like you, until I got into this, I had no idea. In fact, I was shocked to find out that Jews have final confession. The Bushes.
Rabbi, so I guess maybe it might be a discussion for a later part of the course, but could you maybe just talk very briefly, how is the vidui on Yom Kippur different from, say, if it was actually being performed as a last rite?
Oh yeah. So the vidui on Yom Kippur, there are lots of them, and they are in the collective. So the one where we beat our chest, Asham nu, Bagad nu. So there are one confession of sin for every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it basically talks about the sins we have sinned. The other one, which you may know if you've been to to lots of Yom Kippur services, is over and over again we say Al chet shechatanu lefanecha, for the sin we have sinned before you. and then you start listing sins. I'm just going to
Right.
read a little bit of a deathbed confession in my rabbi's manual. I actually have a hospital visiting kit where I have this at my fingertips. The 106. Yeah, so here's, and it says it may be, it's called confession by the gravely ill, but in Hebrew it's called a vidui. Elohai ve'Elohei avotai ve'imotai. My God and God of all who have gone before me, author of life and death, I turn to you in trust. Although I pray for life and health, I know that I am mortal. If my life must soon come to an end, let me die, I pray, at peace. If only my hands were clean and my heart pure. I confess that I have committed sins and left much undone. Yet I know also the good that I did or tried to do. May my acts of goodness give meaning to my life, and may my errors be forgiven. Protector of the bereaved and helpless, watch over my loved ones. Into your hand I commit my spirit. Redeem it, O God of mercy and truth. And then the instructions continue. It says, as the end approaches, the following is said with or for the dying person. Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed. God reigns, God has reigned, God will reign forever and ever. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchato Leolam Va'ed. Blessed be God's name, whose glorious dominion is forever and ever. Adonai Hu HaElohim. These are things we say at the end of Yom Kippur service. And then the Shema. So that's actually pretty traditional. I am gonna see if I can reach. Where's my? Oh, hang on. There is a wonderful book, small booklet produced by the CCAR, and I buy these like 20 at a time, called Mishkan Refuah, Where Healing Resides, and it's prayers for healing for lots and lots of different circumstances. So, traditional Misha Barak prayer for healing, prayers for adapting to new life limitations, waiting for news for surgery, treatment, recovery, pregnancy, birth, pregnancy, loss, infertility, transplant, going home, entering into hospice, chronic illness, dementia, transitions, entering a long-term care facility. It is a wonderful book. I think it's like $6 or something from the CCAR press. And as I say, I buy these by the dozen, and typically when I visit someone in a hospital, leave it with them. Okay, just moving to the end. Reading assignments I am now sending out. And the next class is really going to be a fun one on Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and Zohar. And that is pretty much that. So I'm going to stop sharing and ask if there's any other questions, comments. And Cheryl, you shouldn't be up so late. That's midnight. Any other questions or comments? Okay, hearing none, I am going to go.
I think I'll go make schluffy.
Okay, good
Gay
idea.
schliffen.
Gay
I'll go
schliffen.
schluffen.
Yes,
Gay, yeah,
that's
I haven't heard
Yiddish.
that in a long time.
Yeah, Yiddish for going to sleep. Okay, so good night, and I'll see some of you tomorrow night, also an hour late. So take care and stay well.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.